The United States has effectively abandoned further coordination of military aid to Ukraine today. The Pentagon is officially launching a reorganization of the entire system of military assistance to Ukraine. The key functions of the coordination group, which for 3.5 years distributed aid and worked with allies, are being placed under the leadership of the European allies themselves. And the resources freed up by the United States will be directed toward other Washington priorities. At the same time, the saga surrounding the license to produce Patriot interceptor missiles continues. Donald Trump does not publicly confirm the license for their production in Ukraine. But behind the scenes, negotiations, as it turns out, are ongoing, and the Pentagon has already invested $3 billion in expanding the production of these same missiles. In this episode, we will analyze both stories and how they are connected to the overall restructuring of the American military machine. I will say right away that there is no great tragedy here, but it is important to understand that the entire system of military aid to Ukraine is indeed being restructured. And in a larger episode, we will analyze both, and I would say only Europe will be responsible for the military component of aid to Ukraine. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we get started, I ask you to subscribe to this channel. We are moving forward with this topic, but before we begin, please subscribe to this channel. In this episode, we will analyze both as part of the overall restructuring of the American military machine. So let's start with the main news about the reorganization of the mechanism for military support to Ukraine. According to a statement from U.S. European Command, Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth has ordered the reorganization of the Ukraine Security Assistance Group, transferring leadership of key elements of the mission to allies and freeing up American resources for other U.S. priorities. And now, at the European Command, U.S. European Command emphasizes that this reorganization will not lead to a decrease in the level of U.S. support for Ukraine. Quote, "This restructuring will improve the functional efficiency and effectiveness of providing security assistance to Ukraine by transferring leadership of key elements of this mission to allies, and free up American resources for other global U.S. priorities. In general, this is the very concept of NATO 3.0, when Europeans and only Europeans are fully responsible for the entire security architecture in Europe. The Americans only keep their so-called nuclear umbrella and missile defense umbrella, while redirecting their main resources to the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific region. And we've already talked about this concept more than once on this YouTube channel. And this concept was first voiced by Marco Rubio, today's US Secretary of State, before the 2024 elections. That is, it was still during Donald Trump's election campaign. This concept of NATO 3.0 was announced. In fact, the US is not completely leaving Europe, but we are seeing consistent steps that the Americans are reducing their involvement. Well, it has always been the case that it was American generals, American high-ranking officials, Americans who led such missions as the Security Assistance Group Ukraine. They were always at the head. And even if we recall the Ramstein format where issues of military aid to Ukraine were discussed, it was led by Mark Milley, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States, and the then Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. Yes, Lloyd Austin was the Secretary of Defense at that time. They both always led the coordination together in the Ramstein format. The same thing happened in the Security Assistance Group Ukraine. Now the Americans have left both positions. They haven't left entirely, but have distanced themselves. And now the commander of the U.S. European Command, General Grinkowicz, explained the logic behind these changes as follows. The Allies have demonstrated their ability to take a leading role in supporting Ukraine's defense. He made clear that from the beginning, the U.S. only took on the role of organizer temporarily. That was the plan all along. They took it on temporarily, hoping that sooner or later they would hand this mission over to the Europeans. Here is a quote from Grinkowicz. The Security Assistance Group Ukraine was originally intended as a temporary command. Its transitional phase is based on progress, which we have already achieved, and it helps to create the conditions for a lasting peace in Ukraine. Let me briefly remind you that over the past 3.5 years, this group has distributed more than $2 billion in security assistance. This same group coordinated with allies and partners and contributed to expanding their support for Ukraine. Formally, this is not about the United States leaving the process, but about transferring operational leadership to the allies while maintaining overall coordination. But in simple terms, the essence is this. Previously, the US was in charge, now the US is stepping back and handing over command to the Europeans. But the key phrase here is the freeing up of American resources for other global priorities. And this particular point needs to be understood in connection with what's happening around the Patriot missile issue, because in reality these are parts of the same picture. The US is now trying to redistribute its own military resources among several simultaneous flashpoints. Ukraine, the Middle East, and the overall task of increasing America's own stockpiles against the backdrop of the risk of war in the Indo-Pacific region as well. And here we smoothly move on to the licensing issue for the production of Patriot interceptor missiles for Ukraine. And here we need to lay everything out date by date, step by step, because the signals right now are really contradictory. On the one hand, Donald Trump told us that nothing was agreed upon and there would be no licenses for Ukraine. But it turned out that at the same time things are happening that look like the exact opposite. The fact is that today the US Permanent Representative to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, stated that a long-term agreement on licensed production of interceptor missiles for Patriot will not be in place for Ukraine by this winter. At the same time, Whitaker clarified that negotiations are ongoing. But here's the key point. They are at an early stage and require significant time. Right now, the technical and legal aspects of the future deal are being discussed. Moving on. At the same time, member of the U.S. House of Representatives Mike Turner confirmed that yes, negotiations are underway to provide Ukraine with broader access to Patriot technologies so that the country can establish production and fully master defense technologies. But the point is that this is a very complicated process, and it's obvious that even the stage of coordinating a whole bunch of issues will take a lot of time. And let me remind you that back in July it became known that Donald Trump refused Zelensky's request to provide Ukraine with 300 Patriot missiles by this winter. And that's when the idea came up, okay, let's give them a license so they can produce these missiles themselves. And according to the Atlantic magazine, Zelensky specifically asked Trump for missiles to protect facilities, energy infrastructure, and to counter possible winter attacks from the unwashed savages. And here's a number that explains a lot. According to calculations by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, after the start of the conflict in the Middle East, the Pentagon was left with only, well, here's the exact figure: 759 missiles for the Patriot systems. For comparison, the United States itself produces about 650 of these missiles per year. So simple arithmetic shows that the American arsenal of these interceptor missiles has been depleted by the war with Iran to such an extent that sharing these missiles with Ukraine now means simply cutting into their own reserves. On the other hand, and Atlantic also writes about this, actually these missiles have these missiles, for example, South Korea, I think, has these missiles if I'm not mistaken. Japan definitely has them. Some allies, even in the Middle East, still have them. So basically, if you look around the world, there are certain stockpiles. And if you really want to, you can gather these missiles. But at the same time, the opposite process is happening, a large-scale increase in the production of these missiles. On August 3, the United States Department of Defense signed a framework agreement with Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman to expand production capacity for components of PAC-3 interceptor missiles for Patriot systems and THAAD interceptors. The contract amounted to more than $3 billion. The agreement will allow the production of Patriot missiles to triple and the production of THAAD missiles to increase fourfold. The amount of the agreement for individual components is not disclosed. But it is known that the document provides for the creation of a second source of supply for solid fuel rocket engines for PAC-3, as well as an increase in the production of safe ignition devices. So the point is that additional facilities will be brought online for this. In general, as you can see, the United States of America is not backing away from Ukraine, but you shouldn't expect significant help at the moment either. On the one hand, the US is transferring operational control of aid to Ukraine to its European allies and will no longer handle it themselves. On the other hand, given that the US's own stockpiles of key air defense weapons have been depleted by the war with Iran to a critical level of 759 missiles, Washington is simultaneously freezing the direct transfer of Patriot systems to Ukraine here and now, but is investing billions of dollars to increase production several-fold going forward. And at the same time, it is negotiating the transfer of the interceptor missile production technologies themselves to the Ukrainian side, so that in the future, Kyiv can produce the necessary weapons independently, without relying on depleted American stockpiles. On this matter, I want to respond to some comments now. I didn't expect it. Once again, I didn't expect it. I've realized it's impossible to reach such people. Sorry for this digression. Feel free to skip ahead if you're not interested. I released an episode the other day about Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. In 2023, according to data from, I believe, the New York Times, blocked the transfer of Iron Dome air defense systems to Ukraine, which were at that time in the United States of America. He vetoed it and said, no, these systems cannot be transferred to Ukraine. And at the same time, as they say in the same breath, in that same episode, I gave other information that right now, in fact, Ukraine and Israel are competing with each other for military aid from the United States of America, which is quite obvious. So people concluded for themselves that supposedly I'm explaining it as competition for resources. AMM. I explain why Benjamin Netanyahu once blocked the transfer of the Iron Dome to us, which actually is not the case. I personally never made such an argument. But people tend to draw their own conclusions, which they have every right to do. Everyone has the right to be wrong, as I say. No problem, you made those conclusions, that's your business, just don't attribute them to me. There. What I love most is when people hear some information and then just make up their own version of it. For example, well, they're already calling me an anti-Semite, urging people to protest against Alexei Pechi, like how dare he say something about Netanyahu. There. It sounds very strange to me. It's very strange when they call me Alexei Pechi, an anti-Semite. If you look at the history of my episodes on this YouTube channel, it's very hard to say, but there are some narrow-minded people who have declared a boycott against Pechi in the comments. So, what I'm getting at is that actually, when we hear news that negotiations about granting a license to produce these missiles in Ukraine are being halted, or, as Trump says, there will be no license at all, we need to understand this is a lengthy process. Obviously, no one is going to hand over a license just like that. You need to sign 1 million technical and legal documents just to even start the process of discussing all of this. But the reason I made that reference to the previous episode is because there were even some people who started writing saying, look, why did Netanyahu actually block the transfer of Iron Dome air defense systems to Ukraine in 2023? Because there's corruption in Ukraine, which means these systems would have ended up in the hands of the Russians, or God forbid, in the hands of Iran. So, supposedly Ukrainians would have handed over this technology to the Russians or Iranians anyway, like you can't trust Ukrainians. Are you completely crazy? What's wrong with those of you writing these comments? Let's put it this way. Ukraine has Patriot air defense and missile defense systems. They are in Ukraine. If we follow your logic, why haven't these systems ended up in the hands of the Russians and Iranians yet? Well, that's just nonsense already. But let's get back to the main topic. As I promised, that little aside is over. Let's move on. So, against the backdrop of all these discussions, an article by former White House Russia expert Thomas Graham comes out in the New York Times. And this article claims today, Donald Trump now has a real chance to lead diplomatic efforts to end Russia's war against Ukraine, but this favorable moment may quickly disappear. According to him, Ukraine is increasing the number of strikes on military targets and energy infrastructure deep inside Russian territory. And Russia is simultaneously increasing attacks on Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure, trying to take advantage of the shortage of missiles for Ukrainian air defense. That is the very shortage we talked about earlier. Graham writes that under these circumstances, urgent and intensive negotiations are needed, and only Washington has enough influence and political weight to conduct them. The task is not, as they say, to stop the war right now, but to lay the groundwork for shuttle diplomacy in order to try to overcome the huge differences between Ukraine and Russia. If Russia refuses to enter into dialogue, Trump may still provide interceptor missiles to Ukraine in order to take away Vladimir Putin's main trump card. Ukraine will be able to continue attacks on Moscow. And, well, Putin will no longer be able to attack Ukraine with ballistic missiles so ruthlessly and with impunity. What happens next? Well, let's put it this way. The first scenario is that the Pentagon completes the tripling of Patriot production and quadruples the production of THAAD within the next year or two. And then, once their own shortage is resolved, real deliveries or a production license for Ukraine become politically and materially possible without risking the US's own stockpiles. But that's too long. As you can imagine, a year or two is tough. Hard times will be ahead for Ukraine. The second scenario is if, as Graham writes, the window for diplomacy is truly open now and Washington actually leads the negotiation process. The issue of specific arms deliveries may take a backseat to a broader political settlement right now. That doesn't mean there won't be any deliveries at all, but at least it will shift a little. And it will buy time. And the third most alarming scenario is if the war continues at its current pace, while US military resources remain divided between several conflicts at the same time. Ukraine risks facing the coming winter amid exactly the interceptor shortage that Volodymyr Zelensky himself warned about. So I'll leave it at that for now. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Friends, if you want to support the work of an independent YouTube channel, you can always do so. Financially, with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. Or by using the sponsorship feature on YouTube, right next to the subscribe button, you can click join and choose the support option that works best for you. I would be grateful for that. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave your comments, and click the bell icon. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.